It is such an immense feeling of power to stand in the front of the room and everything goes quiet. My name is Stuart Gordon. I'm the associate pastor here at San Marino Community Church, and it's my privilege, my pleasure to welcome you to today's Sunday seminar, which we hope is the first of many on an irregular schedule about issues of public interest. Most of you have probably been here before, and I have not. I'm new in my role at San Marino Community Church. You've probably come to a Ron White presentation before. If not, you're in for a treat. Ron White is such a gift to San Marino and to this church. He's an actual historian, an actual Christian, an actual minister, wears all those hats with a lot of grace, and offered to make this presentation today on an issue of great public concern, which is the relationship of church and state in a time in which that seems to be under reconsideration, renegotiation. And Ron brings a historian's perspective to it, something that I think you will benefit from today. Glad that you are here for that. And also brings to it the experience of someone who has taught history in universities and has taught in a seminary and a divinity school. So he notes both sides of the equation and is able to offer you his wisdom on what I think is a very important subject for church and state in these days. So I'm thrilled that you are here, looking forward to hearing what Ron has to say. He will speak for about a half hour, and then I'll come back up with the microphone and have a chance to bring the microphone out to you, and you can offer your questions to Ron. I do invite you to remember that it's a question, not a speech, that we're inviting you to make in response to the speaker. And if one gets carried away, I may have to interrupt and ask if there's a question in here somewhere. But I'm sure you've done this before, so you'll know how to do that. But without further ado, let me open our meeting with prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Ron. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the gift of this nation and for the wisdom of the First Amendment, for the wisdom it is to keep church and state as separate entities, one enriching the other. We thank you for Ron White and for the ministry he has undertaken his whole life, and pray that you would enlighten us all as to the relationship between church and state and our role to be faithful citizens of this land. We pray in the strong name of the Trinity. Amen. How about a round of applause and welcome for Ron White?
Thanks. Thank you, Stuart Gordon. Those who are members of San Marino Community Church know that Stuart and Ann arrived just this summer, and I think we would all say, what a gift they are to this congregation and to this community. On Friday, a friend of mine called from Honolulu, a Princeton Seminary classmate, and he started out by saying, I'm exhausted. How in the world do you keep up with everything that's going on in our nation, in the news? I'm just feeling exhausted. My wife, Cynthia, had lunch with a friend this week who told her, I don't watch the news anymore. It's just too anxiety-producing. Well, there is some good news. Yesterday, the Dodgers are still playing. On a combined Saturday, UCLA was not a one-game wonder. They won. They defeated the coach of Michigan State, who grew up in Pasadena as the son of my accountant. And USC beat mighty Michigan. So, wow, things are going well. Breaking news. In the year 2025, Melissa Block, the host for National Public Radio, offered these words. Since the election of 2004, the Internal Revenue Service is investigating 60 churches to see whether their tax-exempt status should be revoked. It's illegal for tax-exempt organizations such as a church to endorse or criticize candidates. Some of you who have been around for some years will know that central in those 60 churches was All Saints Episcopal Church in Pasadena. Barbara Bradley Haggerty, the religion editor, who's a good friend of mine, spotlighted All Saints Episcopal Church because on October 31st, 2004, 1 week before the presidential election, the Reverend George Regas, the former rector at All Saints, spoke about the two presidential candidates, Republican George W. Bush and Democrat John Kerry. Regas told the congregation that they should vote their values in going to the poll, but, said of President George Bush, quote, "Your doctrine of preemptive war in Iraq is a failed doctrine." The IRS sent All Saints a letter saying it was beginning an investigation into whether that sermon constituted an illegal breach of the separation of church and state, and that they could very likely lose their tax-exempt status. Wow. 20 years later, it's a 180-degree term. Long-standing laws, long-standing norms in our country seem to be overturned. There seems to be an alternative writing of American history. For 20 years later, and this is an extra question, how many of you saw the announcement in July of this year about the ruling of the IRS about the revoking of the doctrine of church and state? Good for you. On July 7th, the IRS said they were considering changing the doctrine of separation of church and state because two Texas churches had sued the IRS along with the National Religious Broadcasting Association. And so the IRS, in their present ruling, yet to be fully ratified, says, communication from a house of worship to its congregation through customary channels about electoral politics, viewed through the lens of religious faith, is not considered participation or intervention in a political campaign. There's so much going on that I think a lot of people have missed this. But this is a big question. I think it's potentially overturning 200 years, more than that, of American history. We'll come at this at the end. It's not yet been ratified, but no surprise, it will be brought before a judge in East Texas in a district in which there is only one judge, so you can't give it to other judges. And this judge is notorious for his rulings in recent years overturning this and that and this and that. So it's very likely that the IRS ruling will be ratified. Question, do we want our ministers, priests, and rabbis endorsing political candidates? Do we want the governing bodies of our congregations in this particular church, the session, do we want them speaking out about political candidates? Well, that's the conversation for this afternoon, and we'll have that conversation. I've done something to help our conversation. I've suggested that this new book by Randall Balmer, America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State, is a very, very helpful primer. I know Professor Balmer, he's a professor at Dartmouth College. He's written a great little book. How could you publish a book of that size? That sort of gives the whole history of how we got to the separation of church and state and what have the challenges been since its adoption in the Bill of Rights in 1791, because there's been other efforts to sort of say we have to endorse that we are a Christian nation. So we'll talk about that. So I want to do four things. First, I want to look at the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, and these two clauses about religion. Fascinating. Then what I'd like to do is to look at those 13 colonies and how did they figure out establishment? Why did they do that? What was establishment taking place in the different colonies? Because there was no consistency whatsoever. They had all come from Europe. They'd come from countries that were Roman Catholic or Church of England or Reformed, on which establishment was just a given practice. But they came up with a novel idea in this country that that should not be the case, that there should be separation of church and state. Not that that was anti-religious, but it would put religion on a level playing field. Then I want to introduce to you a movement that you may or may not know. It's the movement that started long before 2024, to overturn the separation of church and state, I want to introduce you to David Barton, who his friends call America's greatest living historian. You may never have heard of him. And he is on a nationwide tour, which he calls the American Restoration Tour, to restore America as a Christian nation and to say very loudly and clearly the separation of church and state is a myth. It has no absolute standing whatsoever in the Constitution. And when one of the quotations we saw as you came in, you'll see it more as we go forward, Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation is completely misunderstood. It has nothing to do with the separation of church and state. And then we'll talk together and say, well, what do we think in 2025? Who are we? What should we be doing? What does this really mean? How might we decide this issue? The Bill of Rights. Let's put up here before us the First Amendment. It's interesting. Someone said, should I be taking notes? Is this a history class? I used to teach a class for many years in the 1990s and early 2000s in the history department at UCLA called Religion in American History. And I always had a lecture on the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. I discovered, not to my surprise, that although the Bill of Rights is a very hallowed part of our Constitution, it's not really very well known. And so we looked at this. There are two clauses here. Fascinating. James Madison was really the person who wanted to have the Bill of Rights, but he didn't want to have the Bill of Rights. When the Constitution was finally ratified, he opposed having a Bill of Rights. He said, that's redundant. We don't need a Bill of Rights. It's all right there in the Constitution. If we start adding things, that'll be bad. Then he goes home and runs for Congress, and his opponent says, if you're not for a Bill of Rights, I changed my mind. I'm now for the Bill of Rights. What happens when you run for political office? So there were 21 potential amendments to the American Constitution. It was narrowed down to 10 in the Bill of Rights. And it's interesting, what is the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, in recent days, we've probably given far more attention to freedom of speech or of the press. I want to suggest that the first part of the amendment deserves our attention very much. Notice that there are two clauses. Interesting that they would go about doing it this way. The first clause says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This means they did not want to have a national religion. We'll learn very quickly that Connecticut continued with an establishment of religion. Massachusetts continued with an establishment of religion. Why did they do that? How could they do that? And secondly, and balancing it out, I think, is or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's very much in the news today. Those who are arguing in the IRS case are saying that the separation of church and state is taking away their free exercise. People need to have the freedom to exercise their religious faith. So part of the tension here is, can you exercise your religious faith and still have the separation of church and state? So how did this Bill of Rights come into being? Well, James Madison was a very important person in this. He was our fourth president of the United States, but also equally important was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. He noticed that the Church of England was established in Virginia, but actually the Baptists and the Presbyterians were far more numerous than the Church of England. Well, how could that be fair if the Church of England was established? Now, Jefferson was no particular friend of traditional Christian faith. Some of you may know that he published his own Bible, in which he took out all the miracle stories. He cut out all of these different things he didn't like. Jesus was a moral teacher. Jefferson was a deist. If there is a God, God is a watchmaker somewhere above, but he does not intervene. And so here you have different points of view, but all coming to the same conclusion, the separation of church and state. the separation of church and state. Let's now go to the next map on the screen to see exactly how we got there. How did we really come to this point of view? Here we have the 13 colonies, and what's really interesting is in Massachusetts and Connecticut, these were the heirs of the Puritans, of the Pilgrims, of the founders. There were an established church. It was the Congregational Church. Today we might call it the United Church of Christ, but it was the Congregational Church. It was the largest church in the American colonies. And they believed they could be established because they were the patriot church. They were the church that founded this country. They deserved to be established. So they were established. Then you had the Church of England, which is established in the southern colonies, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And also, interestingly, in 4 colonies of New York. Well, who were these people in America in 1776 or 1787? Interestingly, 85% of them were Calvinists, or what we would call the Reformed tradition. Congregational, Presbyterian, Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, French Huguenot, even some of the Anglicans in Virginia were Reformed. What did that mean to be Reformed? It meant these were people who believed, as Calvin said, the world is the theater of God's glory. And Calvin, the progenitor of the Reformed tradition in Geneva, said there is the right of resistance. And so those who resisted against King George III looked to this Reformed, or we would say today Presbyterian tradition, for the right of resistance. So this was the establishment. Well, what would happen when the Bill of Rights was put in place? Let me tell you the story of Lyman Beecher. I think often history is told in stories. Lyman Beecher was a great pastor, preacher in Connecticut. You may know some of his family. What a Zion of a family. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Catherine Beecher, progenitor of education for women. Henry Ward Beecher, the great minister in Brooklyn where Abraham Lincoln spoke before he became president of the United States. Edward Beecher, who became president of Illinois College. So Lyman Beecher looked with alarm that the establishment might go away in Connecticut. It was still there in 1817 after the Bill of Rights. Then there was an election, a close election. Beecher was so worried. What would happen to the church if the taxation that supported the church went away, if it had lost its public place in the state of Connecticut? And sure enough, establishment was defeated very narrowly. So Beecher was in a deep depression. But a little bit later, he wrote in his autobiography, "Now we are thrown upon our own resources and upon God." Jonas Sheik, who has done the video for this, was telling me of his experience in Germany. I remember when I first went to Germany, I took a group of students from Whitworth College, and I was quite surprised by 2 different realities. On the one hand, the facilities of the church in Germany, be it Catholic, Reformed, or Lutheran, were just magnificent. The college campus ministries, but no one was attending church. And Jonas said, yes, every German citizen has 10% of their paycheck taken out by the government to support the established churches of Germany. You have to go through quite a rigmarole to get out of paying that 10%. And then Jonas made a comment that I'd never quite thought about before. Our congregation, maybe your congregation, is involved this fall in kind of a stewardship campaign. He said, isn't it wonderful in America that you can decide for yourself how much money you would like to give to a congregation? That's your decision. Now, Andy, I haven't talked with you, but Jessica's told me this story. I know when I studied as a young man in England that England still to this day has what's called religious instruction in all the public schools. But, he's laughing, I was shocked to find that many of the people teaching religious instruction were not religious. But this was part of the established church. The year I studied in England, I remember we had this great event in the great Lincoln Cathedral, and the mayor was there, and the bishop was there, and everything was all merged. But no one is attending church. I was privileged to speak in England in the fall of 2019, and I went to John Stott's great church, All Souls Church in London, and I sat next to an English woman, and she said, "Look around you." She said, "2/3 of this congregation are immigrants. The people in England are no longer involved in the Christian faith." And she said, "I lay that a lot to establishment because we did not have to step up for ourselves, and we didn't have to step up and make a contribution to be involved. We allowed the state to decide what the church would be." If you've seen The Crown, you will know again and again and again how the Queen was the head of the Church of England. And so, fascinating. Sidebar, there were 3 Reformations. Martin Luther began the Reformation. John Calvin was a second-generation theologian. The Church of England was a political revolution. King Henry VIII didn't want the Pope telling him who he could marry or who he could divorce. So people came to this country having come from this experience of establishment, and now they had to decide how are they going to live in this particular situation. And one by one, they had begun already before the First Amendment to disestablish their churches. But let's back up for a second. What did establishment mean? What would be the benefit of being an established church? The first was it offered you some sort of official state-sponsored recognition. You were the Anglican Church of South Carolina. You were the Congregational Church of Connecticut. Secondly, it offered financial support. You didn't have a choice. Part of your taxes were given to the church to support its ministries, to support its clergy. In some ways, it was also, thirdly, used to control public life. The established church had certain qualities, certain benefits. And finally, sadly, the fourth quality was it restricted other people. Why did the Pilgrims come to the United States? Because they were disallowed from entering Oxford or Cambridge. They were dissenters. The irony is then they became the established church, but the established church often put a big bar up against those who were not Baptist, who were not Methodist, who were not whatever. So this was the benefit of establishment. And we'll see in just a minute that those who are arguing against the separation of church and state argue that we need to restore some of those benefits of religion in public life. Let's do that now. Their desire was to suggest that we ought to do this, that 4 different planks, I think, underlie the conservative response to the separation of church and state. First of all, they say we've misunderstood the meaning of the Bill of Rights. We've misunderstood Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation. It was never meant to remove religion from the public square. They claim that this idea is modern, liberal, historically inaccurate. So really what's up for judge right now is what is the meaning of American history? Several months ago, I received an invitation from the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. to participate in a project next year in 2026. They want to put out a kind of a handbook for people with a site in every single state of a place you might visit a National Park Service. And I was quite interesting that in the first 2 paragraphs, the woman who wrote to me 3 times talked about America as an exceptional country. And then she said, now, if you accept this offer, we want to be very careful. She said, like, if you go here, they're going to talk about slavery. We don't want to do that. If you go here, I don't think I can participate in this project. So I wanted to know, who is this person writing to me? And I Googled her online and discovered she's a faculty member at Hillsdale College, this tiny college in the state of Michigan that is really a bulwark behind this entire movement. I've actually spoken there twice. I don't quite know how I got invited, but they do sometimes invite mainstream speakers. And I spoke one evening on General Ulysses S. Grant as general. And the person who followed me, I thought I could not believe what I was hearing. was arguing that Richard Nixon was not guilty in Watergate, and Haldeman and Ehrlichman were not guilty in Watergate, and the only reason they might be accused of being guilty was because they'd be tried by black juries in Washington, D.C. This is the rewriting of American history. We need to be aware of what's taking place. So the first argument, and I get the argument that religion should be a part of American culture, American life. The second one was, if we don't have a more robust religion, this is the reason we are losing our kind of public morality. On the surface, that sounds like a very logical argument, doesn't it? That we need to have a more religious foundation to promote public morality. Thirdly, some conservatives link religious freedom to the principle of limited government, arguing that protecting religious institutions from government interference is a bulwark against the state overreaching in our society. And what do they want to do? First of all, they would like to have prayer in public schools. You remember the superintendent of education in Oklahoma said the Bible should be in every classroom, and we should have religious symbols on government buildings. Now, we can talk about this. Our guest author here, Randall Ballmer, suggests, if you remember in his foreword, that he was a kind of a guest person in one of these law cases about having this. So how is this movement going forward? Let's go to the next slide if we can. Well, here, this is Thomas Jefferson. Let's pause for a second. Thomas Jefferson, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment or religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson had received a letter from Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut. They were concerned that in Connecticut, congregationally established state, they were not getting the full opportunity to express their faith in the way they wanted to do so. So Jefferson, who's no friend of the Baptists necessarily, he writes back with this really profound statement, and this is where we get the phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. Now we'll go forward if we can. Here we are. David Barton has become a leader in this movement to restore America as a white Christian nation. He is called by his advocates the greatest living historian. Now, actually, he doesn't have a doctor's degree in history. He has a BA degree in religious education from Oral Roberts University. In 2012, he published a book on Thomas Jefferson, which purported to claim that Thomas Jefferson was not a deist, but actually a profound Christian. It was published by Thomas Nelson Sons, which in Nashville, which is the largest Christian publisher in America. And there was such an outcry against the book, and some by conservative scholars, that they withdrew the book. They pulled it off the market. But make no mistake, this is happening. I'm going to put on the back table here for your perusal at the end this, I think, remarkable book called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. I found myself literally shocked by this book. I grew up in a tradition where I just expected that I didn't want our minister to be talking about who should we vote for. He's telling story after story after story after story. If the minister does not tell you who to vote for, we will get rid of the minister or we will leave the congregation. This is just happening across America. The kingdom, the power, and the glory. So David Barton is the one who is producing this phenomenon. Well, what do you think? What's at stake? Is it possible that we can claim as Christians, as was said so beautifully by our pastor, Jessica Von Lohr, this morning, that our fidelity to Jesus Christ is our primary allegiance in life, that we have two allegiances, the Christian allegiance and the national allegiance? Is this possible, that we can have a vital Christian faith and at the same time have the separation of church and state? Or is the separation of church and state outdated? That perhaps it served its time in an earlier generation, but as we see kind of an increasing secularism, as we see a kind of breakdown of morality, the divisiveness in our culture, is it time to say, well, no, we need to have a stronger Christian presence. Let's do away with the separation of church and state. After all, it was a myth from the very beginning. So when Stuart and I decided to do this seminar with conversation with Jessica, we just feel that in a church like this is the moment to talk about these issues. I'm a huge fan of the great 20th century theologian Karl Barth, who was exiled by the Nazis and then stood up to speak against them. And he said we should always read our Christian faith with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And I think that's what we're attempting to do here today. We come in the midst of this Christian congregation and ask this important question, which I think has not received the attention that it is due. I want to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ron. As good as I expected. Hands, all you need to do, just like in school, just raise your hand and I'll come to you. And if you'll tell the rest of the group here your name.
Fred Sodwoodle. Ron, does the ability to practice your own religion, the freedom to do that, imply other rights that you would have too, such as to use the public hospital or the public school or to vote in an election? The reason why, Ron, I'm asking you this is that Israel, as you know, has a Declaration of Independence. And in Israel's Declaration of Independence, it states that Israel's religion, established religion, will be Judaism, but all Israeli citizens will have the right to practice whatever the religion they want to. So can you apply from this right to freely practice your religion the right to bring your child to the public school, to be able to work in Israel proper, the other part on the other side of Gaza, to be able to use the court system if you're not being paid, to maybe even vote in the elections of Israel, all because the right to practice religion as you want to would therefore imply other rights. And as you know, Golda Meir and other great Israelis have signed on to that. So I'm just wondering if this is a stepping stone that can be used for Israel to become more inclusive.
Thank you very much. You've informed me about this. Are you suggesting, therefore, that we'll maybe go back? Yeah, here we are. The two clauses that Israel is not suggesting that Judaism is the only established.
No, it does. It states very clearly Judaism is the official religion of Israel.
Right.
And then in the next clause, it states all people in Israel have the right to practice whatever religion they want to, freedom of religion. It mirrors our own Declaration of Independence a little bit. But if you literally interpret that, if you have the right, all people in Israel, to practice whatever religion they want to, well, would those Muslims and be able to therefore have other public rights that would treat them as equal citizens? And if so, then maybe that might be a good idea. What do you think?
Well, I guess the question is, and I think it's implied in what you're suggesting, is do those other people, do they actually have those rights? Or is this simply on a parchment on a piece of paper?
It's on a piece of paper. It's enshrined in Israel.
Yeah, I know it is.
The Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
But it's signed off by Ben-Gurion, by Golda Meir,
Yeah.
by a lot of people who did become prime minister later. But you could use that to imply, because Israel does have a history, as you know, of extending equal rights until about 1967.
Yeah.
And by then, a lot of those original founders had already served or they were dead.
Right.
So, Israel's changed. But, can they go back to that document and say, wow, if we give Muslims the right to practice however they want to, then maybe we should give them other rights too.
Yeah.
Just a thought. What do you think?
Well, yeah, and interestingly, just a historical footnote here, when the Confederacy was formed in 1861, they made a big point of the fact that God is not mentioned in the Constitution. So they said, well, we're going to put God in the middle of the Constitution. So the question is always between what is on the piece of paper and what is the actual practice. Yeah.
Others?
Do I have to stand up?
You don't have to.
Yes, I'm a friend of Ron's. I'm Nancy Mackey. I notice in Jefferson's statement that he uses religion and church interchangeably. But if there were an establishment of religion, does this not open the way for an establishment of temple and an establishment of mosque?
Thank you, Nancy. Well, you'll notice if you have a chance to read Randall Ballmer's book, he talks about the fact that the language is not consistent. Church, religion, it's used in various forms by various ways. So you've pointed out the fact that, is this open-ended? I mean, the question for today, trying to think of the incredible scholar at Harvard and the New York Magazine who's just come out with a new book saying, is it time to amend the Constitution? And why can't we amend it? Is this a Constitution that can last into the 21st century? You know, when Cynthia and I went to New Zealand about several years ago, I was taken aback by people who came up to us and said, we feel so sorry for you. And I said, you do? Yes, she said, you have an 18th century Constitution, and you'll never be able to deal with 21st century problems. Boy, most of, an 18th century Constitution. So that's another question, would we amend it? Because it wasn't obviously in the view of the framers in terms of, there were very few Jews. Catholics were literally 1% in 1776. The huge Catholic immigration would begin in the 1830s to become the largest church in America. But that wasn't in the eyes of the founders when they started this process forward of forming a Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Judy Durf. I'm also know Ron well and appreciate your historical take on what you've said. You always elucidate so much for us. I actually, Ron, think there are two issues involved. One is the issue of the establishment of a national religion, okay, what you've presented, if we didn't already know, shows that there is a great movement among certain sections of this country for the establishment of a national religion, period. There is also the issue, I think, of whether or not churches of various kinds might speak into the political arena. And being a Presbyterian, I know how clearly Presbyterian pastors really try to avoid that. And I am personally coming to the opinion that without the establishment of a national religion, which I support that we would not have one, that pastors need to start speaking out against this and against the abridgment of rights that I and think many, many people are seeing. So I think there are two issues, and we have to keep them separate, but I'd appreciate you talking about the role of pastors today.
Thank you, Judy. As I have talked to pastors here and across the country, this is a huge issue. I mean, I was speaking for 5 days at a church in Florida in February with a pastor I really, really appreciate. And he really was struggling with this whole issue. I mean, one side of Florida is Democratic, the other side of Florida is Trump country. He's got all these people in his congregation. They're coming down for 5 months from Ohio, or is it New England? And he was asking himself the question, I know that there's Republicans and Democrats in my congregation. How do I, in one sense, address these important issues without coming across as boom or boom and alienating people? So I think the modern minister is caught in a dilemma never before. I think this is a very, very difficult. You could go back and say, well, in the civil rights issue, we had to stand up for this. But I think it's a different milieu that's happening right now. And the whole Charlie Kirk phenomenon kind of lifted that thing up as to what is really going on here. Yeah.
Ron, let me follow up on that when I see a couple of hands, and I'll get to you. What are the risks to a church which embraces this ruling by the IRS? What are the risks of a church saying, okay, all the boundaries are down, all the constraints are off, and we can endorse candidates and endorse parties?
I think the risk is that the division we see in our culture, in our politics, will then become even more the division that we will see in our churches. Although I have to say that when I was in Dallas some time ago and speaking to the head of the Bush Library, he said, what's his term? He said, we're all segmenting. He said, you can't be a Democrat in Texas, and you can't be a Republican in California. Everybody is segmenting themselves. They're moving. There's now a real estate company called Conservative Move. And, and they will move you from California or New York. Guess what's the leading destination? South Carolina. Texas is second. So in other words, we are segmenting ourselves. We all probably in this room right now could tell the story of a brother or a sister or a mother or a father that we have difficult talking with because we have such different political points of view. Do we want this in the church?
Ron, I learned recently that people are now more likely to marry someone of another religion than someone of another political party.
Wow.
I'm Rebecca Thompson, and the first line of the First Amendment, endorse or criticize. Can you pull that? You had it in bold, or if not, just jump. Ron, help me with that.
Just pull the First Amendment back again.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Congress shall make read it for me.
Congress will make show no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Okay, so the first one, the establishment of religion, I personally would not want my Presbyterian church to be publicly endorsing something. So I'm against that. And then the next one says what?
The next part is, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which means the government cannot prohibit you, cannot stop you from expressing your religious faith.
The endorsement bothers me. The criticizing is, to me, the one that pastors need to be very careful with. I am at a church where every time there is an issue publicly, the pastor speaks the words of Jesus from the Bible. The words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, are all the opposite of what's happening in America today. Love and kindness and care for your neighbors and care for the foreigner and the widow and the children. Those are Jesus's words. All you have to do is preach Jesus's words. You do not have to criticize. That word I worry about. But Presbyterians are called thinking people with warm hearts. We are thinking people, and all that preacher has to do is preach Jesus's teachings, and I am a thinking person. In every second of that service, I am saying this is not what's happening in America today. They do not have to mention anything about government. So that's my thoughts on those two words, endorse versus criticize.
Thank you. You know, we've gone through a sermon series started by Jessica in this congregation asking this question: does our faith influence our politics, or does our politics influence our faith? A couple of years ago, I participated in a Board of Trustees meeting for Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington. And they had in their kind of mission statement this word evangelical. And they were really wrestling this because they said evangelical was forever and ever and ever a religious word, and now it's a political word. It's a political, do we want to use that word anymore? It becomes a real problem, I think. Yes?
There was another hand here.
Yeah, I think all this division in our country is frightening for our country's future. And what we are not getting from institutions are emphasizing what we have in common. And how often do you hear the word respect from either side? And I don't know if that's a question or just a comment, but is there some, I guess my question is there something that we can do about emphasizing the positive instead of the negative? I mean, some of us grew up in a generation of positive thinkers, and this is not what's happening in our country now, and it's frightening, because we're going to not only lose our churches, but we're going to lose our country if we're not careful.
Well, I want to do some, I'm qualifying your Stuart when he said you can ask your question. No, I welcome your comments. I mean, this is part of what we're doing right now, is the comments. How do we understand what's going on? And I would add, and what does this mean for our young people? When they see this taking place in the church, is this the church they want to join? That's the question, yeah.
Hi, Harold Ray. Ron, for those who want the church to have influence on the state, what do they think about the equivalent of the state then having influence on the church? Is that going to be barred somehow?
Well, that's part of the present issue, I think, Harold, is that if the state begins to come down on a particular form of religion, a particular style of religion, is that what we want? Because the First Amendment, if you think about it, is really double-edged. It's both worrying, as we said in our announcement of this seminar, do we want a state-sponsored religion or do we want a religion-sponsored state? And now, do we want a religion-sponsored state? In other words, now we're having prayer meetings in the Department of Defense. But what if I don't want to attend the prayer meeting in the Department of Defense? Or perhaps I have a different opinion as to how to attend. This is not my particular cup of tea, but I am also a Christian. What is that doing to institutions like this? I wonder.
John Jones, and it's not a statement, it's going to be a question. Just in case anybody wondered. History teaches us a great deal about what the future. Where do you think we're going to be 10 years from now with this issue?
Whew. Is there a next question? Where will we be 10 years from now with this issue? You read all the same surveys that I do, that people are quite discouraged about the future of our country, and they're discouraged because of the divisiveness, the inability to talk to each other, to respect your word, to respect each other. I can't answer that, but this is why we're having this seminar, to think, how do we understand this particular issue, separation of church and state? Yeah.
Albert Lazzarini.
Yes.
Going back to Mr. Barton's, you had a slide about the
Right.
fellow who's advocating for a change. To what degree do you personally feel that it's kind of a proxy for racism and xenophobia?
To what extent is Mr. Barton's campaign for white Christian nationalism a proxy for xenophobia or anti-trans or whatever? I think it's quite embedded within that. It's very clearly there. It's clearly there in the churches where he travels, in the audiences that come to hear him. I don't personally think there's any difference. It's quite clear, yeah. It's who he is. I mean, the name of his, I could have showed another photograph of him in a tall Texas hat, and the name of his organization was Wall Builders. So you can just sense the ethos of what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Todd.
Hi, Ron. Todd Edwards. You brought up morality a couple of times, and I guess my question is, it seems every time this comes up, it's we've lost our morality. And I just wonder, can you talk about the history of that? Because as someone growing up in the 80s as a kid, there was the satanic panic, like every kid's going to be a Satanist. And it always seems like this morality panic is an excuse to have overreach in other ways. less freedoms, controlling in a manner. So can you just talk about the history of moral panics and how the state has reacted to that?
Well, I take your comment that there's often an overreaction. I hadn't quite thought about what you describe, or your words, moral panic. I would say that if I could put this in a larger historical framework, that the unexpected trajectory of moving away from the church, and we've now experienced this in COVID, is the trajectory towards a rabid individualism. This is my right and what I can do. And when I read the founders, or when I read the 19th century, there's a much, much greater sense of community. I go way, way back, so when I went to college, we read David Rees-Monn's book, The Lonely Crowd. And he argued, the great sociologist, that up until World War I, we were an other-centered society. We were concerned about the other person. We were concerned about the other mother's child. And then we began to become an inner-centered society. We began to focus on ourselves. What's good for me? What's good for my child? And I think underneath this whole conversation is this individualism. That's what's tearing us apart. The inability to see that I might want to vote for something that's really not good for me, but it's good for the whole community. And when I go back and read the founders, I just find a much greater sense of community. Underneath the checks and balances of the Constitution, and underneath the discussion of separation of church and state in the Reformed tradition, was the profound understanding of sin, of selfishness, and that we have to be careful that we don't have a selfish society. The reason that they wanted to restrain the presidency in the Constitution was they had had a king, and they didn't want another king. And so George Washington, in his farewell address, he only served 2 terms. He could have served 5 terms. He was so popular. This is what he said: "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion." Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. So in a sense, religion has been a bulwark of this, but now religion itself has become part of the divisiveness. So I'm not quite sure how to answer your question in terms of how we got from the 1980s to today, but I do believe that in this individualism, there is a place for the church which offers a sense of community. I think there's an opportunity here, there's an opening. I think people are hungry for this. In the February 2025 essay in the Atlantic magazine, he calls it the anti-social century. He said, it's not just that we're working at home. We are staying at home. We are no longer inviting people into our homes. We're no longer going to church. We're no longer going out to the restaurant. We are living in little modules of our lives, individual modules. And he said, we have to get beyond the anti-social century and begin to discover other people and what they can offer to us.
Ron, I'd like to add one word to that response.
Please.
To Todd. This is the other side for people of faith who are committed to a separation of church and state, not therefore afraid to say, we do believe that it's written within the nation's history that all of the founders, regardless of their religious convictions, did believe that virtue was necessary for freedom to flourish. You know, we've all heard comments like it's a republic as long as you can keep it, as long as you can tend it. And so people even like Jefferson were pragmatic enough to realize that religion served a public purpose of morality in a society that gave so much liberty to individuals. When I went to the Constitution Museum in Philadelphia last year, there's an amazing presentation at the beginning in a circular theater with an ode to freedom, but never was able to say what our freedom is for. And we've come away with a notion of freedom that it is, I am free from anything and everyone who would interfere in my life, but no understanding of what we are free for. And theological convictions across the theological traditions are we are free in order to seek the good of community and other and world. And so I think Ron's point is that, yes, there may be poorly used religious authority, poorly tended to, emphasis on minor things of morality, and in ignoring the major concerns, like maybe Rebecca was talking about, that that a society needs in order to be a free, safe, orderly, compassionate society. Yes. Ron, how long are you willing to go? We're at 3 o'clock. We got like at least 6 comments in the room. You want to give me a time to end?
Well, we'll go 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes. Right back here.
Hey, Ron, Terry.
Terry.
Good to see you. It seems to me that your illustration of David Barton raises a very important and maybe the driving issue, and that is, how do we discern truth? So he can have his preferences and opinions about what was there at the beginning, but undergirding those preferences and opinions isn't much. Therefore, Thomas Nelson pulls the book. I just heard Francis Collins, former director of the NIH, speak last week, and he feels like the underlying issue is the credibility of truth. In science, certainly, and he's lived right through the middle of all that. Speak for a minute about what does it mean for us as a people and a culture emphasizing community if truth is really being eroded in the way that it is?
Thank you, Terry. Well, I've suggested the way we discern truth is one way that we write history. And I find nothing wrong with saying we are an exceptional country, and therefore we're willing to talk about all those things that have been difficult in our history. I mean, Jonas, who is our director of digital ministries, told me that as a child growing up in Germany, he was taken 2 times to the death camps, and every single child in Germany must go to the death camps. And they will not accept the reason that I was not born. That is not a reason for you to say I am not responsible. So part of this is, and I'm going to Washington next week, I'm really worried with credibility of truth. What's going to happen to our institutions? The African American Museum, the American History Museum. These are marvelous institutions that have been curated by terrific people. An alternative to Hillsdale College is a terrific series going on now from Yale University with 3 great historians called America at 250. You can sign up for it, but 2 weeks later you can get it on YouTube. America at 250, David Blight, the great biographer of Frederick Douglass, and 2 phenomenal female historians are doing this. We need to find these sources out there to counterbalance what we're hearing or not hearing, what we're reading or not reading. Yeah. I think Francis Collins, who I'm hoping might even someday speak at this church, would be a terrific person to kind of tune into what is he saying. Yeah.
Okay, Rob.
Just an historical observation. I graduated the U.S. Naval Academy 1962, and attendance at chapel was compulsory, or you could join a church party in the city of Annapolis, but everybody was required to go to church. There was a Protestant service followed by a Catholic service, and I repeat myself, but you could, pardon me, this is it. Anyway, and the ACLU took the service academies to task and sued them in about 1980, and church attendance was overruled. One other comment, he was an instructor at Marine Corps Basic School in Quantico, Virginia, and he made the comment, and he fought in World War II, and he said, there were no wounded Marines who were atheists.
Thank you.
Ron, Tom Toole, I just wanted to, I appreciate so much your remarks. I just wondered that our United States Senate has a chaplain and our House of Representatives has a chaplain, and there's been a long history of this. I've had the privilege of knowing some of these chaplains and actually leading prayer at these institutions. But I wonder, what do you think about that? How is that possible with the separation of church and state? Because I know even people like Barry Black and Lloyd Ogilvie and Dick Halverson and so forth, Margaret McGibbon, have Bible studies and study groups, conversation groups for senators and members of the House during the time. I wonder, how does that square with the separation of church and state?
That's a great question, Tom, and it's one of the primary questions, including chaplains in the military. And again, the political process enters in because you would know very well that Margaret McGibbon, a Princeton Seminary graduate, was fired by Speaker Johnson. Fired by Speaker Johnson because she dared to say something in her prayer that he did not like, so he fired her just on the spot. So it's been a long-standing tradition. We got to come back and think about that. How and why do we have that? In the military, they would, I guess, argue that, well, we've got a whole variety of chaplains, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, so that maybe answers the question. We're not establishing one religion. But you're correct. We've had these remarkable people who've been chaplains of the House and the Senate from the very beginning, and it still continues. I'm not quite sure how we square that with the separation.
Well, and even Thomas Jefferson himself was not averse to having public expressions of faith in religious services.
Right.
There's some nuance to Jefferson's position, even though he himself didn't share Christian convictions. Roger, did you have your end?
Tom stole my thunder.
Okay. Bong.
Hey, Ron.
Hey, Bong.
Not an expert, but I have a couple of suggestions that we can do. I mean, I heard a comment of regarding what the church can do in educating the congregants in this. A couple of observations I would like to share. Let's be more critical of religious arguments when they serve political ends, is what I'm trying to say, especially when they impose on civil and liberties or equal rights. The use of scripture and theological reasoning as opposed to simply political or cultural rhetoric to push back against extremism and exclusionary interpretations. The church should push more for just, compassionate Christianity, one grounded in love, mercy, service, as opposed to fear, judgment, or political power. And finally, my final observation is this: encourage dialogue. We're doing that right now. Encourage dialogue, persuasion, and reclaiming moral, spiritual vocabulary so that our Christian faith isn't monopolized by ideological extreme groups. My 10 cents.
You can tell why we're so pleased that Bong is a part of the staff of this church. Thank you, Bong. That's terrific. One more question, one more comment, maybe?
The chaplains do a lot of the counseling in the military.
Huh?
The chaplains do a lot of the counseling. Many chaplains are probably here. And you simply say, do you want to go see the chaplain or do you want to go see the old man?
Yeah.
And they want to see the chaplain.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right here.
Ron, it's good to hear you again, and I'm grateful for this opportunity and what you have shared. I come from a generation where the church spoke and led on many of the important social issues before our country. And I'm deeply saddened by the sense that the church has gone silent on issues that are extremely important moral issues. It's not a matter so much of endorsing candidates as it is speaking against the horrendous suffering going on around us and being very concrete and specific. And that leaves me wondering about the church's future and hopes for it. You have any thoughts on that?
That's a wonderful, wonderful final comment. Your deep experience in the civil rights movement, traveling there to be a part of it. So you make the distinction between talking about political candidates and the church's silence, lifting up important moral issues. And the question becomes again, how do we do that? We've had people suggest here that if we're really talking from the Bible, if we're thinking theologically that there is a way to do this. So I think that may be the challenge for us, that the separation of church and state in no way limits our ability to lift up the great moral issues of our time. I want to thank you for coming. We're going to do a second one. Next year is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And maybe in February we'll put on another seminar. It will be, is the Declaration of Independence simply an historical document that separated the colonies from England? Or is it, as Abraham Lincoln believed, a reforming document which is still yet to be reformed? Thank you very much for coming.
You know what that applause means, Ron. That means thank you. What a gift Ron White is to our community. We hope that you did provide your contact information as you came in. If you didn't, you still have a chance to do so on one of the clipboards, because not only are we interested in doing something on the anniversary of the Declaration, but also just many more Sunday seminars on issues of public concern. If that's something you're interested in, please let us know how to contact you so that we can let you know as we do so. Let's close with prayer. For this land, we pray, O God, because it is our calling as people of faith to pray for the nation in which we live. Not that we imagine it the only nation blessed by you, but a nation in which we live and for which we hope the best. We pray for this land that there be here justice and peace and order and goodwill, and that we all, as citizens, would be concerned not just for ourselves, but for the communities in which we live, from the greatest to the least. Thank you for Ron White and his leadership, and for the privilege it is to learn more and to serve more faithfully, and to seek your call for us in this day and time, this precious day and time in which there are great needs for peacemakers, for reconcilers, for those who can speak the truth in love and listen to one another carefully. We pray in the strong name of the Trinity. Amen. Thanks, everyone.